Okay, I do not know how many of you have come here because of archaeology and how many came here because of Temple Mount. I did not really, I'm not that knowledgeable about archaeology. I'm here more about Temple Mount, but there are a few things that we can say about the relationship between archaeology and what is going on Temple Mount. And perhaps to some extent I could define myself as a 21st archaeologist. But let's start with things that have already been said here. Let's start with the fact that we know that archaeology is not just a science that assists us in knowing the culture and the civilization and the history in an era in which communities imagine themselves to death and look for ancient roots to reinforce their national narrative and national solidarity. Archaeology, I think, is a very important tool in the generation and establishment process of the national narrative. It's even more so in an area in which there is such a conflict between two nationalities, between two fighting sides that fight over the territory, over the land, over the sovereignty over that land, and every party sees in it its ancient homeland, its indigenous birthplace. And in such a situation, archaeology would be better off to be very, very measurable, measured, and prudent. My interest in archaeology can be exhausted in a number of things. I deal with conflicts in holy sites. This is my field of study in the past few years. I examine and study what brings about the outbreak of conflicts on holy sites, how these conflicts evolve and develop, who the players involved in these conflicts are, how every party responds and reacts to actions taken by the other side, and we'll try to study and see if there's any hope at all that we can offer, any solutions or any models that we can offer on how to handle, how to prevent such conflicts, and once these break out, how to handle them. Perhaps my first comment to the topic that is on the agenda tonight is that it's very clear, right from what Yoni said here, that when we talk about Temple Mount, and it's not just Temple Mount, it's not just that, area enclosed between those four walls that is called Haram el-Sharif, or the Muslims call it today Al-Aqsa, concerning the entire precinct. It's not just Temple Mount. We are talking about a whole area that surrounds Temple Mount, that at least the Palestinian Muslim side sees it as part and parcel of Temple Mount. As far as they're concerned, the Mughrabi ramp, the Mughrabi Gate for sure, and the Mughrabi ramp is a part of Temple Mount. The Western Wall Plaza is a part of Haram el-Sharif. The tunnel leading to, or that tunnel that leads from the city of David toward Temple Mount is a part of Temple Mount. So all that is happening in Siluan, in the city of David, is a part of what is happening in the enveloping area around Temple Mount. The Western Wall tunnels are a part of the Temple Mount. What happened in 1996 when Olmert and Netanyahu decided to open the northern outlet of the Western Wall tunnels? It was because of that. As far as they're concerned, it was the violation of a status quo in that extended precinct of Haram el-Sharif. What can you do? The Western Wall tunnel is attached to one of the walls of Haram el-Sharif. And this is why when we handle this entire issue of excavations and diggings, be it archaeological or tourist-based diggings or any other action, for example, exchanging or replacing a ramp that leads to the Mughrabi Gate that collapsed in the winter of 2004 because of the rain, and it needs to be replaced with a more efficient functioning bridge. That too is a part of an action that needs to be taken into account and seen as something that, in my view at least, is not something that can be forced upon any side unilaterally without discussing this first, without first of all consulting with other relevant elements that play in that arena. And in any case, whenever whenever we do any unilateral actions, be it the opening of the Western Wall tunnels, and I'll soon go back to this incident, and whether it is all those actions that are related to actually demolishing the Mughrabi ramp and replacing it with something else, when these were done unilaterally, the result was always detrimental to the Israeli side that initiated it, because the Israeli side usually, in a way, wants to feel that it sort of lives under the illusion that it has sovereignty over East Jerusalem and Temple Mount. Ladies and gentlemen, Temple Mount is not in our hands. The Western Wall is. The Temple Mount is in their hands. That was a decision taken in June 1967, whether we like it or not. There were various considerations. If you read the minutes of the government meetings, there were very important political considerations that were taken into account, following which Moshe Dayan issued the instruction to remove the flag from the Dome of the Rock and to deposit Temple Mount in the hands of the Muslim clergy. The actions that we are actually resorting to in Temple Mount, when there were unilaterally, when Arik Sharon visited Temple Mount in September 2000, there were many other actions that I can mention. Every such action that was done based on the wish to demonstrate sovereignty and establish it on the ground, and that's the archaeology around Temple Mount, whether we admit this or not, and we can actually sort of classify people as those who admit this and those who don't, more well-established archaeologists and more critical ones that are less, institutional ones. Archaeology is a part of that game of a struggle over the identity, over the sovereignty, and the privilege, or the right, to decide what future this place would have, this place called Haram el-Sharif or Temple Mount. In literature, we are familiar with various types of criticism. I believe Yoni hinted at that. And I don't know if you know the Nadia Abul-Hajj's book, Facts on the Ground, that caused a lot of noise in the US, of all places, because the anthropological researcher that studied the archaeology of Jerusalem criticized Jerusalem's archaeology. I'm not her mouthpiece, and I don't think that she's right in all her claims, but I do think that one cannot ignore the three basic fundamental arguments she makes, even if we do have very good answers. And she accuses archaeology in Israel in a number of things. First of all, it's the tendentious choice of those sites where excavations are conducted. The second thing is that whenever an excavation is conducted, it is done in certain cases, not in every case, but in certain cases, it is done in a very speedy, very deep dig with bulldozers to get to those layers of the first temple and the second temple, because that's what we care about when we look at this type of archaeology. And the third argument or accusation is also true for me as a historian or many sociologists who are engaged in that field, the gap between facts and interpretation. We're all living on facts, but we build mounds of interpretation around those facts, and in those interpretations you can manipulate interpretation, and interpretation is always prone to criticism. So the example of Nadia Abul-Hajj, one of the examples she brings is the case of the burnt room in the city of David, and perhaps some of you know that. And the interpretation given, the minute they found one of those rooms and saw that it was burnt, there was a certain interpretation given to it that linked that burnt room to the destruction of the second temple by the Babylonians in 586, and this interpretation was based on coins that were found in that layer that come more or less from the same era. But that's how it was perceived. How can it be that when, I don't know, if there are archaeologists in the room, you'd probably be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but she argued that various carbon tests that were done, carbon-14, are accurate for 50 years, and how can you set a specific date and to say that it was in 586 BC? These are arguments that are voiced, and there are answers given by Gideon Avni and John Seligman in an article that they wrote about archaeology in the area of Temple Mount, or the southern part of Temple Mount, and the Church of the Sepulchre, and they argue that archaeology that is conducted in Jerusalem is according to scientific criteria. Yuval Baruch, whom I saw earlier here, he too wrote an article about this in Haaretz newspaper. I believe I read this, and even the considerations that guided him and the Antiquity Authority in actually destroying the Mughrabi ramp were based on professional considerations only. And to a large extent, that is true. But we must take into account the fact that archaeology in such sensitive places, because in Temple Mount, one does not excavate, only in the surrounding area. And the surrounding area becomes wider and wider all the time. So you have it's Isaac's tent synagogue, and you find more and more caves to dig, and it's truly fascinating to discover the past that we have. But the question is, do we also know how to tell the story in full, not just to tell a partial story and to say that we found only those findings that come from the first and second temple, and by that we reinforce the Jewish relationship to Temple Mount.
Can we actually tell the story, the narrative of Jerusalem, and that in itself is a challenge, as the destruction of various cultures and that kind of through threshold, that really we want to, after all, attract so many tourists to Jerusalem, rather than depositing the responsibility, the archaeological responsibility, and the narrative of Jerusalem only in the hands of few groups whose tendencies are very exclusive, Jewish, very national at times, nationalistic at times, that want to make only one side more salient and stand out more when we talk of Jerusalem. And I just wanted to add a few things about two specific incidents or affairs that took place around the excavations on Temple Mount. Now, first of all, the Western Wall tunnels that took place not long after the Temple Mount was in our hands. They started actually in 1981. Some of you perhaps remember. And after that, Yuda Getz, he found some kind of opening there, some kind of sort of opening, a void or a vacuum that led into one of the cisterns in those tunnels, one of the water cisterns under the Temple Mount. And then they gave instructions to actually go towards the east, so perhaps we will discover the holiest of the holies. And then the WAC found a sort of hole there in one of the temples, and they said that above that one of those water wells they could hear sounds, noises, and understood that the Jews had penetrated all the way to there, 20 meters inwardly, and they went down with ropes, and there was a whole kind of clash between the laborers at the time, and Menachem Begin then obstructed and blocked with cement that opening, that void, and you can still see the remnants of that if you go into the tunnels under the Western Wall. So on one hand, of course, you can say, yes, there are fears. The Sheikh Zalach spoke about that. Yes, what do we want to destroy the Temple Mount? But in their eyes, in the eyes of many Muslims, and not only those here in Israel, and don't forget that they are over 1 billion, not only 8 or 9 million people. And amongst those Muslims, there is a kind of nucleus that one can build a myth on that. In other words, it's embedded in that. And the story is that, of course, they do want to destroy it, the Israelis. That's what they're claiming. And, of course, you have members of Knesset who actually supported that. So you have Gershon Salomon, who thought that he was surrealistic and he was just a sort of extremist minor group. But now this is really as if penetrated the establishment. And in a way, this, in their eyes, it's just proof that all their hallucinations have suddenly become reality. And therefore, I would like to reiterate that we truly need to be very cautious. And again, the second thing is that when we broke into the actual Western Wall tunnel, that brought about a collapse of the modus vivendi that had existed between the Waqf, the Jerusalem municipality, and Israeli police. Until then, there was a status quo, there were understandings, and that status quo on the Temple Mount were not only connected to the right of the Jews to access there, it was connected to their rules of conduct and the opening hours and the policy at the openings and all those issues inter alia, the actual demolishing of things around that area, the building of things around that area. And during that period, when they thought of turning the tunnels into a tourist tunnel, there was a kind of secret, a confidential dialogue in those secret fora that really strengthened the modus vivendi, which I call the modus belonging to Teddy Kollek, wherein they would sit and quietly agree things that they weren't written down in the minutes, but there was a consensus between the various parties. Inter alia, the Israel Antiquities authorities would actually have a right specifically there, but after they broke through into the Hashmonaim's actual breakthrough into that tunnel, then of course this completely collapsed. And Moshe Shachar, the minister, tried after a meeting wherein the Waqf had asked in January, when there was rain, that they should open up the Solomon stables for Muslims so that they would be able to pray there under the cover because of the rain. And that, you can see in the Marwani Hall. And of course, if they want to open something up, so at this opportunity, let us also ask to open up the actual Kotel tunnel. But the mistake was that they wrote a letter to the Waqf after that in order to try and cover that up, as if trying to find a cover that could create actually and incite riots. And the letter was then countered, there was a letter sent back that we never wanted bloodshed, and of course we would not have to wish to have a detrimental effect on tourism to Jerusalem. We know what the results were, bottom line, and I won't expand on that, and I know that my time is running out. But, for example, what we called the sifting project, and I think one should understand that the Waqf didn't think that it ever had a detrimental effect on the archaeological findings or excavations from the First Temple times or Second Temple times that they were denigrating in any possible way. But the Waqf side simply did not believe that there was something before the actual mosques were founded. According to their tradition, the Al-Aqsa Mosque was built not by Abul Malik in the 7th century, but rather there were traditions that said that it was built by Ibrahim, by Abraham, others by the seraphs, by the angels. In other words, there were various traditions. In other words, that compound was built beforehand as Al-Aqsa, and then it only became a mosque later on. And they do not believe that something else existed. They don't believe that they're actually having a detrimental effect on anything or that they're harming anything. and they know that there are rules, but they need to be preserved and maintained by all the sides. So therefore, if we want to actually emanate from here with any insights and to know how to be wary and cautious on the Temple Mount, then we must understand, it's incumbent upon us to understand that the entire area around it, that entire precinct cannot be dealt in unilaterally, because unilateral steps will so far bring a loss of rights and sovereignty. For years, Jews couldn't visit Temple Mount. After Ariel Sharon went up to the Temple Mount, we lost. Recently, we actually brought it back, but we had lost that effective supervision of the Israel Antiquities Authority because of unilateral steps that had been taken. And secondly, I believe that there ought to be a much closer supervision of archaeological work, the institutional one as well. There has to be a much more effective supervision on what is being done in the hypersensitive locations. And I also think that it would be wrong to give various NGOs and archaeological contractors to work on behalf of the official archaeology, because I believe that those NGOs and various subcontractors and contractors have a specific agenda that they want to achieve. And I think that a kind of state approach should be taken by the state and the government rather than by subcontractors. And two additional things that I think ought to be done, and that is not to enable various sort of equipment to be brought in without very close adherence to rules and supervision. And perhaps last, there's another entity which I believe whose role is perhaps to restrain, but that restraint doesn't always hold it, and that is the police. And I heard the chief of police saying that there are people, members of Knesset, who go up to the Temple Mount and they're inciting, instigating by doing so. And I think that the police, under his command, trampled too crudely on those understandings of the modus vivendi that they had in the past by, in fact, backing various steps, Muslim steps and other Jewish radicals or extremists who tried to strengthen their hold on Temple Mount. And such steps ought to be much more restrained than they have been recently.